Las Vegas, the night of Tom Jones's biggest show yet. 40 minutes before the curtain, a producer pulled him aside with one piece of advice. The dressing room was already crowded, wardrobe assistants making last adjustments, a hairdresser working quickly, the low hum of the orchestra warming up somewhere beyond the wall. Tom sat in front of the mirror, jacket open, going through the small rituals he always went through before a big night. Breathing, stretching his jaw, running through the opening bars of the first song in his head. Everything was set. The set list had been rehearsed for days. The opening number, the big one, the one the audience expected, the one built to hit them the second the curtain rose, was locked. Then the producer knocked, stepped in, and asked for a minute. He was not a young man. He had been in the business for decades, had shaped nights for performers whose names filled marquees long before Tom's ever had. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply leaned in, said a handful of words to Tom, quietly, almost as an afterthought, and then left, off to check on a dozen other things before the doors opened. Tom sat there for a moment, looking at himself in the mirror, the words still hanging in the room. He had 40 minutes to decide what to do with them, and what he eventually did would become one of the most talked-about openings of his entire Las Vegas career, though almost nobody who talked about it afterward ever knew where the idea had actually come from. To understand why this particular night mattered so much, you have to understand what it represented for Tom at that point in his career. By the early 1970s, Tom Jones was no stranger to Las Vegas. He had performed there many times, built a loyal following, filled showrooms night after night. But this particular engagement was different. The hotel had invested heavily in promoting it. The room that night was filled not just with the usual crowd of tourists and regulars, but with people whose opinions carried weight. Other performers, industry figures, critics who wrote for publications that mattered, people who had seen everything Vegas had to offer and were rarely impressed by any of it twice. For Tom, this was the kind of night that could shift how an entire industry thought about him. Not as a hitmaker with a catalog of singles, but as a Vegas headliner in the truest sense. Someone who belonged in the same conversation as the city's most legendary names. Everything about the show had been built with that audience in mind. The lighting, the orchestra arrangements, the pacing, all of it designed to make the strongest possible first impression. Because in Vegas, first impressions on a night like this had a way of becoming permanent reputations. The plan, as it had existed for days, was simple and proven. Tom would walk out to the big opening number, full band, full lights, full voice from the very first note. It was the version of Tom Jones that audiences came to see, explosive, commanding, impossible to look away from. It had worked before. There was no reason to think it wouldn't work tonight. Outside the dressing room door, Tom could hear the room filling, the murmur of hundreds of conversations, glasses being set down on tables, chairs being pulled out, the particular sound a showroom makes in the minutes before it goes dark and the spotlight takes over. Somewhere out there, in seats reserved weeks in advance, were people whose written opinions could shape how this engagement was remembered for years. Tom had performed for difficult rooms before, but rarely one where so many of the people watching were watching professionally, weighing every choice he made before he'd even made it. Except that the producer, standing in the doorway of that dressing room, had just suggested something else entirely. What he said to Tom was simple, quiet even, something along the lines of, "Tonight, don't try to win them in the first 10 seconds. Let them come to you." It wasn't a demand. It wasn't even really advice in the sense of a clear instruction. It was more like an observation, the kind of thing a man who had watched thousands of opening numbers over the decades might say almost in passing, without expecting it to change anything. But for Tom, sitting there with 40 minutes left, it landed differently than the producer probably intended. Tom knew, better than almost anyone, what it felt like to walk into a room and feel like he had something to prove. He had spent years of his career being underestimated, written off early on as a singles act, a passing trend, someone whose success might not last. He had built his entire stage persona in part as an answer to that doubt. If anyone questioned whether he belonged, the answer was to come out so strong, so immediately, that the question evaporated before it could even be asked. That instinct had served him well. It had built his reputation. But sitting in that dressing room, with the producer's words still hanging in the air, Tom found himself wondering, for the first time in a long time, whether that instinct was the right one for tonight. Whether, in a room full of people who had seen explosive openings 100 times before, from 100 different performers, doing exactly what they expected might actually be the safest, least memorable choice available to him. There was a version of tonight, Tom realized, where he did everything exactly as planned. The show went well, the audience cheered, and the next morning the reviews would say all the things reviews usually said about a good Tom Jones show. Energetic, polished, professional. Nothing wrong with any of it, and nothing anyone would remember a year later either. The producer hadn't told him what to do instead. He'd simply planted the question, and now Tom had less than 40 minutes to answer it. What Tom did next, nobody on his team was expecting. He called the band leader into the dressing room. He didn't ask for a different song. The set list itself stayed the same. What he asked for was something stranger. He wanted the opening number, the big one, the one built for maximum impact from the first note, performed almost the opposite way. He wanted to walk out without the lights up. He wanted the band to hold back, to play the opening bars far quieter than written, almost like a rehearsal, almost like something half-finished. He wanted to start the song seated near the edge of the stage, singing the first verse in something close to a whisper, as if he were singing to one person in a small room rather than to a packed Vegas showroom. And only then, after the first verse, after the audience had leaned in, after the room had gone quiet in a way Vegas rooms rarely went quiet, would the lights come up, the band swell, and the song explode into the version everyone had been expecting all along. The band leader, to his credit, didn't argue. There wasn't time to argue. He simply nodded, gathered the musicians, and ran through the new arrangement once, quickly, backstage, in the few minutes before the doors opened. A couple of the older players exchanged a glance, the kind that said they'd never opened a show this way before. But there was no time left for questions, and Tom's instructions had been clear enough to follow without rehearsal. When the curtain rose that night, the room was already buzzing. The kind of anticipation that comes from an audience that knows it's about to see something big. The lights were down low. The orchestra was barely audible. And there, near the edge of the stage, sitting on a simple stool, was Tom Jones. Not the explosive, commanding figure the posters promised, but something quieter, almost private. For a few seconds, the audience didn't know what they were looking at. Some of the critics in the room, the ones who had seen everything, exchanged glances, the kind of glance that says, "Is this a mistake, or is this on purpose?" In the front rows, a few people who had seen Tom's shows before leaned toward each other, whispering, trying to figure out if something had gone wrong with the lighting cues. Then Tom began to sing. His voice, at first, was barely above a murmur, the opening lines of the song delivered as if he were thinking them aloud, almost to himself, rather than performing them. The room, which had been buzzing with conversation just moments before, began to fall silent. Not because anyone asked it to, but because nobody wanted to miss what was happening. The silence deepened. Glasses stopped clinking. Even the waiters, mid-step between tables, seemed to slow down, trays balanced carefully, eyes drifting toward the stage despite themselves. Somewhere near the back of the room, a couple who had been deep in conversation since they sat down found themselves, without quite noticing, leaning forward in their chairs, drawn toward a stage that was giving them almost nothing to look at, except a single quiet figure and a single soft light. And then, exactly at the moment the song called for it, at the exact instant the audience had leaned in as far as they were going to go, the lights came up, the orchestra surged, and Tom rose from the stool in one motion, his voice exploding into the full, unmistakable power that had made him famous in the first place. The room didn't just applaud, it erupted. The kind of reaction that comes not from being given what you expected, but from being given something you didn't know you wanted until the moment it arrived. Several of the critics, the ones who had exchanged those uncertain glances only a minute earlier, were on their feet before they seemed to realize it themselves. Afterward, people talked about that opening for years. Critics who had personally seen hundreds of Vegas openings called it one of the most effective they had ever witnessed. Not because of the volume or the lights or the orchestra, all of which Tom had used 100 times before, but because of the 11 seconds of near silence that came before any of it. What almost nobody knew, what Tom never made a point of explaining, was where the idea had actually come from. Not from weeks of rehearsal, not from a creative team brainstorming new ways to surprise an audience. It had come from a single sentence, said quietly in a dressing room, 40 minutes before the curtain, by a producer who likely walked away from that conversation without giving it a second thought. For Tom, the lesson of that night went beyond the performance itself. It was a reminder that the loudest, most obvious choice, the one built on proving something, on meeting an audience's expectations head-on, wasn't always the most powerful one. Sometimes the most commanding thing a performer could do was the opposite of what everyone expected, even for just a few seconds, before giving them exactly what they came for. It also told Tom something about the room itself, about Las Vegas, about audiences in general, that he hadn't fully understood before that night. He had always assumed that a Vegas crowd, especially one full of people who had seen everything, needed to be overwhelmed immediately or risk losing them. What that opening proved was the opposite. that the same audience, given a reason to lean in rather than sit back, would meet a performer halfway, and that the meeting point was often more powerful than anything achieved by force alone. In the years that followed, Tom would occasionally use variations of that opening, a quieter entrance, a moment of stillness before the explosion of sound and light that audiences associated with him. It became, in its own quiet way, part of his stagecraft, a tool he could reach for on the nights that mattered most, when the show itself needed something the lights and the band couldn't provide on their own. But he never forgot where it started. Not in a rehearsal room, not in a creative meeting, but in the few minutes before one of the biggest nights of his career, when a producer who had seen it all offered a single, almost throwaway thought, and a young singer from Wales, with everything on the line, chose to take it somewhere nobody in that room could have predicted. It wasn't the note itself that mattered in the end. It was what Tom did with the few minutes of doubt it created, and the willingness, even on the night that meant the most, to risk doing something nobody asked for.